This is Business I Am. Welcome to Metropole Television. My name is Simba Elijah Charles here again. Now, the International Monetary Fund has projected that Kenya's economy will grow by 1% this year. This, as the IMF projected that the global economy will contract by 4.4% this year, warning of a long, uneven, and uncertain recovery. This as an upward revision from an estimate of negative 4.9% made in June stands to be what we're working with right now. The IMF's projection assumes that social distancing due to the coronavirus pandemic will continue into 2021 and that local transmission will fall everywhere by the end of 2022. IMF's chief economist, Gita Gopinath, said that the latest World Economic Outlook, that was the revision, was driven by better than expected growth in advanced economies and China during the second quarter of the year and signs of a more rapid recovery in the third quarter. However, the IMF has warned that the coronavirus crisis is far from over. Today, let's take a different twist and see what members of the economy, including the church, think in terms of our chances for the growth of the economy. And this morning, just to help us paint that picture, we are still joined by Tommy Rendell and Father Charles Chilufya is the Director, Justice and Ecology, Office, Conference of Africa. How are you doing, Father?
I'm doing well. And how are you doing?
I'm very okay. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I want to pick from this perspective. What do you think that the church stands in this? And the Pope has stated that Africa should be given the first priority when it comes to funding. What are your thoughts on this? Is it true? Should we give it a different approach?
Sorry, I lost you for a bit.
Yeah. All right, let me go back on that question, Father Charles, on exactly where we stand in that. Now, the Pope said that when it comes to funding, especially when we look at what the effects of the coronavirus pandemic has been, isn't that Africa should be given the first priority when it comes to issues funding. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, first of all, it's important to realize that even though Africa hasn't been as badly hit as the rest of the world health-wise, it has been the worst hit in economic terms on account of the lockdowns that have been imposed and the disruption in the supply chains, bearing in mind also that the large part of the African economy, 80 to 90% is informal. Women and men that you see selling on the roads, selling in the markets, were not able to get any income on account of the lockdowns because the roads were not as used as before, the markets were closed, and various other installations, economic facilities were not operational. So that's on the microeconomic level. It just simply means that the men and women that you see on the roads and in the markets who rely on selling goods and services couldn't earn the income they normally do. And that just means that they have no money to buy whatever they need to put food on the table. So they were badly hit. And then, as you know, most African countries depend on exporting of commodities. And they depend on exports to China and to Europe. And in both of those places, ports were closed down. So the money that African countries earn in terms of dollars or foreign exchange was not coming in. So there was a disruption at the macro level as well as at the micro level.
Pretty much now for Father Charles. But let me just get back on you. Has this not exposed our over-reliance on other economies as a continent, though?
Yes, that's just what the situation is. For the last 50 years, we've been talking about diversification and we haven't. But also we must bear in mind the way the trade works in the world. Africa mostly exports commodities. That means raw materials, and almost more than 70% to Europe. And that's just the way the structure is. So we could begin or continue to talk about Africa doing trade more among themselves but for the future. But for now, as you know, things weren't just moving as they normally move. Supply chains were disrupted, and goods and services couldn't move across borders and within a country. So, whatever way you look at it, Africa was going to be hit. But like you said, Africa was much more hit than other countries, and this has meant that more people have fallen into poverty. In fact, they have estimated that 39 million more people in Africa have fallen below the poverty data line. That just means, in simple terms, they have no access to water, they have no access to shelter, they have no access to food, they have no access to basic needs.
Pretty much. Now, let me therefore paint a picture of this. Now, given that Africa is the worst hit further this morning in terms of the effects of the economy, what importance can the $2.5 million World Bank loan proposal to IMF, how would it come in handy? It looks like a small portion to the problems that the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed Africa to.
Yeah. Globally, the IMF has put aside 1 trillion to help countries deal with COVID-19. Yeah, and part of that is what will come to Africa. So what we are pushing for is for the IMF to expand that facility to something like 2.5 trillion. So far, we have the IMF that has released some funds under various facilities. The World Bank has also done the same. The Africa Development Bank has also done the same. And the G20 countries have extended a facility of suspending debt service that poor countries, especially those in Africa, have to make this year. So they've initiated what is called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which means that African countries will not pay money in debt service to countries of the G20 this year. But all of those initiatives, which are very good and they are laudable, are falling short of what Africa needs. For the next 3 years, Africa will have a shortfall. Okay, of all the facilities that have been available to Africa, there will still be a shortfall of 100 billion US dollars for the next 3 years. Yeah, so Africa will still need support in that regard. And as I mentioned, it's worse hit than any other place in the world. If that is not meant, it just means people are gonna die. It has already been projected that by the end of the year, 12,000 people will have died from hunger in Africa. Yeah, and if nothing is done, that means more people will die of hunger next year. So where do we get the 100 billion from that we are having as a gap in financing this year, next year, and 2022?
Just before I bring in a Tommy Randall this morning, Father Charles, then the question is, well, what can Africa do, therefore, to sustain themselves instead of depending on donations and loans from others? Because now we're talking about this financing gap that everybody talks about addressing, but in the meantime, or in the longer term, what steps can we start taking as a continent to make sure that we always don't depend on finances and loans and grants?
Okay, 2 quick things. Number one, Africa really has to do something about the way our economies are structured, need for more diversification, and need to promote growth that leads to job creation. At the moment, there isn't enough job creation. Exports to Europe or to China or elsewhere. So that we need to build in mechanisms to enhance knowledge in our production systems so that we do not just export raw materials, but we export more of finished goods. That will give us more income, but that's in the long term. But we must also pay attention to the structure of the global economy. There is a lot of injustice in the global economy. There's need for certain adjustments to be made so that other places like Africa are not unjustly sort of excluded from the global economy. As we speak now, Africa's share in the global economy is only about 3% or below. And also at the same time, Africa loses on average, as we heard in the UNCTAD report this year, 89 billion, okay, every year in illicit financial flows. Meaning those who are supposed to pay taxes don't pay them, but they externalize their profits outside at the expense of the revenue that Africa should be receiving. So while we talk about all the deficiencies that Africa is facing, and some of them on account of endogenous problems or problems within Africa, there's a lot that needs to be changed. We need a tectonic shift in the financial, the way the global financial systems are arranged. They are currently working against Africa. So on one hand, Africa must do its part. On the other hand, what Africa is asking for is not charity. It is asking for justice. So that what we're supposed to earn in trade, we earn it. So that what we're supposed to earn in what we export and what we make through businesses that run here must come back to Africa and must not leave Africa in form of illicit financial flows. We are demanding justice and not charity. That's why the church is speaking out loud to ask the rich northern nations, the IMF, to support Africa in this period to walk through this very difficult patch by helping Africa to restructure its loans and also to renegotiate some of the other loans that it owes bilaterally to countries like China.
But man, Father Charles Chilofia, thank you very much for joining us this morning for that conversation.
Thank you.
All right, now let me bring in Tommy Wendell, therefore, to paint a picture of exactly the conflict we've seen in the numbers. Tommy, now, IMF says, this Kenya's economy is just 1%. Now, CBK says they're quite optimistic. It's going to be more than 3.5%. Tommy, who's correct?
I think the CBK is being overly optimistic.
Yes.
But also we have to acknowledge this is a good thing either way, because initially the projection was that we're going to have a recession. That means 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. But now 1% is way better than a recession. 3%, it's much better. And I would think where the discrepancy here is in the informal sector.
Yes.
I don't think the IMF has ever captured a way of being able to properly report on what goes on in the informal sector. So that is the number one major difference, in my opinion, that I feel is that shows the difference in those numbers.
Pretty much. Tommy, let me take you back to our Q2 numbers, which were just released the other day by KNBS. I mean, let's talk about what have been traditionally our biggest contributors to our GDP. Wow, tourism contracted by 83.3%. Let's go on to where we were. Manufacturing contracted with 3.9%, sorry, and transportation, which is also our biggest contributor, contracted by 11.6% from a 7.6% growth the previous quarter. Do you think that, well, when you look at these numbers, and you and I have actually spoke about this in the first part of the show, I'm talking that our export numbers have been looking good amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's where the CBK is coming from in terms of their optimism. Do you think that when you look at manufacturing, negative 3.9%, tourism, negative 83.3%, when you look at transportation, negative 11.6%, do you think that's where you look at it and say, maybe you guys are being, I would say, overly optimistic?
With transportation, we can see why. They've reduced the number of people who can sit within a matatu.
Yes.
And also people are less likely to travel knowing that there's a pandemic out there. However, those numbers still are recovering slowly. Tourism, that we can understand. There's a lot of flight bans in other throughout the world. Our biggest market for tourism here is usually Europeans, and they're just trying to get their systems right within Europe. And even that has some problems. You can see that countries are rating others with a different color zone, where if you fly from one country to another, you can't come in, or when you come in, you have to have some kind of quarantine. Nobody wants to go to quarantine on holiday. Now, that will pick up too, slowly as things standardize. As far as manufacturing is concerned, it had a lot to do with which we've left. Now, as to Mr. Kagwe's numbers of yesterday, is expecting a second wave. Hopefully, this will not bring another lockdown. Provided things continue as business as usual, then the economy will definitely grow. Manufacturing will grow, and then we will be closer to CBK's numbers.
Yes, let me take you back to 2008, Tommy Randall, because that's what our reference point is in terms of the worst time that we did experience an economic downturn. But the thing is,
Yes.
we still managed to post a 3.2% growth in terms of economic growth that year. Would you say that the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic in the country have been worse than the 2008 post-election violence period?
Yes, because what happened in 2008 was very specific to specific locations.
Yes.
COVID is the entire country.
Yes.
You can't run from it. Whether you're in Mandera or whether you're in Mombasa on holiday, COVID is there. POV was mostly isolated into very specific locations.
Yes.
And kept there to allow the country to still grow. So that is the major difference between what happened in 2008 and 2000 and now. And I guess it's not really the best comparison. I think we've had worse situations in the past, maybe more area with structural adjustment programs. I think that is more of a better comparison.
Yes. All right,
Yes.
let me just clear this conversation with you this morning, therefore, Tommy. I mean, well, we hopefully we're not talking about a second wave of infections, but there are those fears that if we look at the positivity rate that we're coming from, then Kenya could be actually getting into that second wave. But from what you said it this morning, Tommy, when do you expect? I'm not talking about a recovery, I'm talking about a proper rebound. When do you expect for it to happen? Which quarter of next year?
I would say second quarter of next year.
Yes.
And that is where the government steps up its testing. We need more testing, more testing, more testing.
Yes.
And if there is no second wave where that will require another quarantine, I would
Yes.
say second quarter of next year.
Pretty much. Tommy Randall, thank you very much for taking your time this morning to speak to Metropole Television.
Thank you.
20146 as your SMS line. My name is Simba Elijah Charles Kiage. Good morning.